Welcome to the Darkstream, VOX'S, voxday.blogspot.com, and unauthorized.tv. Thanks for tuning in. I am continuing our conversation that we were having about Machiavelli and the disintegration of empire. And tonight we're going to talk about Machiavelli and the importance of community. Now, just to refresh your memory a little bit, as to what we were talking about. We were talking about the dissolution of Italy that Machiavelli addressed in the History of Florence. This was the map of the major players: Kingdom of Naples, Republic of Florence, Republic of Venice, Duchy of Milan, and the Papal States being the big players. And eventually, you saw players from the outside getting heavily involved, the Ottoman Empire, Kingdom of France, and so forth. And how this relates to what we're talking about tonight with regards to community is this was a more realistic breakdown of the various communities, the more significant of them, that made up these larger republics, kingdoms, and so forth. Now, what we're going to draw on tonight is less Machiavelli's History of Florence and more his discourses on Livy. And now I haven't finished reading them yet. I was starting to read them in English, and then I was mocked by certain family members for not reading them in Italian. So now it's going to take me a little longer because I don't read as quickly in Italian as I do in English, but you do occasionally pick up some nuances that get a little bit lost in the translation. So that's actually interesting to see the differences there. Anyhow, the point is that in the beginning of the discourses, Machiavelli makes an important point about whether one is looking at the Roman model or what he calls the Venetian and Spartan model. And what he's talking about there is, although Machiavelli, like pretty much every political thinker since Cicero, including the US founding fathers, reached the conclusion that there's three basic types of government: aristocracy, democracy, and monarchy, and that the best possible government is a combination of the three. Now, that's fine and good and well and all, and Machiavelli appears to adhere to that just as much as any of the founding fathers did, or Cicero did. But one thing that he points out, and Machiavelli is very good at pointing out the practical issues of things. The theory is all very well and good, but you still have to make practical decisions no matter what your theory tells you. And one thing that he points out is who is going to be the guardians of the structure. He actually refers it to the guardians of liberty, but that's not really the context that he's talking about. What he's saying is, who has enough self-control to be given sufficient authority over the other important elements in government in order to maintain the stability of the process? Now, in the United States, that responsibility has been given to the judiciary, the Supreme Court. And of course, that structure has been a complete failure. It won't surprise you to know that Machiavelli doesn't even consider it. What he contrasts and compares is the Roman system, where the plebeians were given the responsibility for guarding the liberty of the republic, versus in Venice and in Sparta, where the nobility was given the responsibility for that. And it's interesting because Machiavelli points out that in theory, it should be better to give that responsibility to the people, which in Roman terms were the plebeians, as opposed to the nobility of the patricians. But in Sparta and in Venice, the responsibility was given to the nobility. And what Machiavelli points out, being ever the pragmatist, is that although in theory the Roman system sounds better, in practice the Venetian system and the Spartan system worked out much better, lasted much longer, and was more effective over time, because the plebeians were never content with their lot. No sooner did they have one tribune of the people than they wanted a second tribune of the people. And he talks about how the people kept creating more and more demands for power over not just the nobility, but over the government in general, until it got to the point that Marius was able to come in. Marius, the new man, was able to come in and take control of the entire operation. And so this is, you might be thinking, well, what does this have to do with community and building communities during a disintegration and so forth? Well, the reason it's important is because we need to answer the question of who is the nobility. Now, this is a fairly famous painting of the Roman Senate. The senators were known as the conscript fathers. They were uniformly patricians. This particular painting is Cicero demanding Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed, if I recall correctly. The significant thing about the patricians and the Senate is that, as a general rule, the nobility in these Italian city-states and in these republics are the descendants of the founding families. So, for example, Machiavelli talks about Siena and the way in which there was a rebellion against the Senate of Siena, which was essentially the 60 founding families. 60 families founded the city of Siena. They maintained their primacy for many, many years. They were the nobility that he's talking about. Same thing goes for Sparta. Same thing goes for Venice. Remember, we talked a little bit last night about how Venice was founded by native Italians who retreated to the coasts and the bays in order to, and the famous Venetian lagoon, in order to escape the invading Lombards. And the Venetian Senate, and they had the Venetians had an incredibly complicated system that was intentionally designed to prevent any one individual or even any one family from obtaining excessive control, the way that the Sforza did in Milan and the way that the Medici did in Florence. No family ever managed to control Venice, because the nobility there, the descendants of the founding fathers, not only controlled the other elements, the popular elements of the people, but they also controlled themselves and each other. And so Machiavelli points out that this is the best system for maintaining societal stability, is putting the responsibility for guarding the liberties of everybody in the hands of the direct descendants of the founding fathers. And in the United States, that concept was explicitly rejected. They refused to accept the concept of any nobility. There is no legal and constitutional nobility in the United States. And that's one reason why, after only 200 years, Americans don't even know what or who they are. They're so de-Americanized, so denationalized, they're so divorced from their republic that they have actually been willing to swallow the subsequent immigrant lies that anybody can become an American. In fact, they can be more American than the actual Americans. And we're not going to get into all the civic nattery and the nonsense of civic nationalism or why it exists. We've talked about it before. I'm sure we'll talk about it again, but it's not relevant now. The important thing is that one of the great historians and political observers and political thinkers who not only observed a very important historical time, but also, the Renaissance, but also was a very, very serious student of Roman history in particular, reached this conclusion. And it's a conclusion that is supported by the complete failure of the alternatives that we've seen in the United States and in a lot of the modern systems, the modern republics. So, you've created the Senate. You've got the founding families. What does that mean? Well, here's an example. This is an old map of what was then called Ferraria. It's usually known as Ferrara now, if I understand correctly. But you notice that it's built on the River Po, so it's got good access to water. It looks like they actually turned the river into a moat of sorts around the whole city, and you can see roughly about the size of what is by modern standards, a fairly small town. But that's a small town that still exists today because it was set up even in fairly difficult times and built adequate protections. You can tell by the shape of the walls, in fact, that these were that survived well into the age of gunpowder, because that's what all those fortifications that stick out are for. And it's why the walls are are angled in order to allow crossing fields of fire. You wouldn't see that in a medieval wall. Let's look at another famous wall, another city that we've talked about before. And this will help you put the size of these things in perspective. This is the second largest walled city in Europe. The largest is Nicosia in Cyprus, and it's Luca. And this is the current extent of the walls. They still stand today. I've actually been to Luca and walked on the walls. The Renaissance walls were built between 1504 and 1650. They're 2.6 miles in circumference. They are 345.6 acres of area. So that's about the size of a city that can last over time, a city that's capable of surviving even long, a century of warfare. The interesting thing about Luca is that despite being located very, very close to the rather rapacious Republic of Florence, it actually was never conquered. It stayed independent throughout, and you can probably see why here. This is a modern photo of the walls, and if you see in comparison to the picture of the people there, the walls are 12 meters thick. You can literally ride bicycles and walk with all four people abreast on top of the walls. What's interesting to me is that this is one of the cities that Machiavelli describes as surviving and being extended. The Romans founded Lucca in 180 BC, It survived the disintegration of the empire. The second wall, the medieval wall, and I'll show you a picture here so you can see how that progression went. Actually, I have another picture of Luca here. This is what Luca looks like today. And look how thick those walls are. You can see they've got the trees and some of the growing up over some of the fortifications there. But the wall is still very, very thick. And those walls were never taken. Here's how the progression went. So the red area is the original Roman settlement. And the blue area is where the medieval walls were built around in 1118. And then the gray area with the dark gray walls indicates the Renaissance walls that were built between 1504 and 1650. And that is, so you can see the original town is much smaller. It's about maybe, it's about maybe 140 acres. And that was enough to get the town started and the Republic survived. Now, I don't know what the rules of the Lucan Republic were. I don't know if they were set up like Venice and Sparta, but one suspects that they were because the city and the Republic survived throughout, throughout the medieval times, throughout the Renaissance. And so I think it's very interesting to learn from the example of successes, because if we want to get through some of the difficult times that we can expect to see in the next 20 years, it's important to be thinking about how much land you need, how many people do you need. And remember, the original nobility in Siena was the descendants of the 60 founding families. So that would appear to be, 300 to 400 acres and 60 families is probably sufficient to create a strong and lasting community, and possibly even a republic that is capable of lasting hundreds of years. Let's look at a couple other places that are a little less successful, but they still exist today. This is Monteriggioni, and I believe it's a little bit north. It's a ways north of Lucca. It's still around. It is a city of just under 10,000 people. But unlike Lucca, you can see there's not much built up around it. Lucca has a whole town, a whole modern town outside of the city walls, as do many of the bigger cities. Florence, of course, Bergamo, you've got the high city and then the low city. And so even these smaller towns managed to survive because they planned intelligently. This is another picture of it, a little less pretty, but it gives you a better idea of what's around it, which is, there's obviously a reasonable sized modern town not too far away, but it's not this town itself. And then this is possibly the most interesting one. This is not a Renaissance town per se, and this is actually a fortress that was created to be a town, and that it is a town now, but this is Palma Nova, and it was founded by Venice I believe it was in the 19th century, and it was created, but they couldn't get anyone to move there. So, this is not an organically grown town, and you can probably tell from the layout. This is something that was very much planned, and it was intended to be a utopia of sorts. I doubt it was because the Venetians actually had to bribe people to live there by giving them free grants of land, free plots, and they would actually send prisoners there, let criminals out of prison early if they were willing to go and live in Palmanova. So I've never seen it. I'd like to visit it sometime because it's such an interesting. It's got such an interesting history. But that's a much more modern construction, and it's not an organically grown town that has been built up by a community of like-minded people who have come together in mutual interest. So, now I'm not telling you that you need to move out of the suburbs and buy a bunch of land, or, I'm not telling you to do anything. I'm simply pointing out that if you're concerned about the long-term direction of the United States, if you believe, as I do, that the United States, like every poorly organized republic, is going to fail and break apart. Obviously, I think the republic failed back in 1860. It's been an empire ever since. And empires are often more fragile than republics. And so the United States has done very, very well to survive as long as it has. Post 1965 and the destruction of the compatible demographics, that pretty much sealed the deal. And now we're starting to see that fallout with BLM, with Antifa, with the riots, with the protests, with all the nonsense going on with regards to the presidential campaigns and so forth. But we don't just have to sit there and let it happen. In the past, groups of people came together and did something to ensure that their descendants would have the best possible opportunity to survive and thrive, even in the face of a century of conflict across the entire peninsula. If they were able to do it, we are able to do it. Just something to keep in mind. And it's always interesting to learn about history, because we will repeat history whether we know it or not. It's not true. They say, well, those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it. Well, those of us who do know history are doomed to repeat it too. But because we know history, we have an advantage. We know what happened before, and we have a pretty good idea what is going to come next. So on that note, I will leave you. I'm VOX'S. This is the Darkstream.